Hi, everybody. Welcome to Lecture 2 of Unit 14, Social Psychology. It's called Social Influence. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about how we interact in small groups. And small groups can mean anything from 4 people to, say, 20 people. This is perhaps the size of a sports team, a small group of friends, or a team at work. So let's take a look at some of the influences in small groups. The first one we're going to look at is called social facilitation. Social facilitation is the idea that stronger responses on simple or well-learned tasks in the presence of others. So, for example, let's say that the girls' soccer team has made the playoffs. So you can assume that they are a well-oiled machine. They have made the playoffs. It is later on in the season. They have done the practices. They have won enough games. They are really, really good. At the first game of the tournament, the stands are packed with fans. So there's a ton of people there. During the first half, the star forward scores 3 goals. So how does this apply to social facilitation? First of all, the girls' soccer team has well-learned tasks in the different plays and the different moves on the soccer field. Second of all, there are a ton of people, so there's a lot of presence of others. And lastly, they have very strong responses where they score 3 goals in the first half of the game. So the more people that are there and the better learned tasks you have, the better off you're going to do. So another example of this might be giving a presentation in front of people. You might practice your presentation over and over again in the mirror, for example. But then when you give it to many people sitting in an audience, you then do that much better. When there are others around, you have more likely to do better when you have well-learned or simple tasks. So some things that contribute to social facilitation: how difficult the task is, what kind of expertise the people have, and then what is going on with the crowd. So you can see in this chart, really simple, it's talking about home field or home advantage in team sports and the percentage of winning, of the home team winning. And so when you talk about home field advantage, it's not just because it's fun and it's exciting to play at home. There is some psychology behind having home field. Our next topic is social loafing. So this sounds kind of funny, but it is something that I'm sure you've all experienced. So social loafing is the idea that people in a group, it's a tendency for people in a group to exert less effort when pooling their efforts toward attaining a common goal than when you're held individually accountable. So it's the idea of working in a group and everybody not really doing their own fair share and leaving it up to one or two others. So we've all probably been sort of the victim of social loafing, where we have to pick up the slack for people who aren't participating. And at some point, I'm sure that we've all been social loafers where we don't do our fair share for whatever reason. So what is the reasons behind social loafing? Well, there's less accountability when you work in a group. If you're solely responsible for something, you feel a sense of accountability for that something. But when there's a group, your accountability is, lessened because there's more people. It's just sort of human nature. Um, and some folks don't feel like they can actually live up to the rest of the group. So they sort of view themselves as dispensable and not really needed towards the group task. So a lot of times they don't exert as much effort. So keeping in mind that social loafing is the idea to exert less effort when pooling a group's efforts together. And so some examples of that. Well, you saw the picture here where the 2 women are painting and the man is sitting on the floor reading the newspaper. And of course, you've done many projects in your school time where you've done a lot of the work, or 2 or 3 of you have done a lot of the work and one person hasn't. And I know that a lot of folks say, oh, well, in school there's the social, you might say, well, in school there's social loafing, but it happens in the grown-up world too. There's plenty of times when grown-ups don't do their fair share. So groups and teams are part of life in the workforce, and it's just a concept we have to learn to combat as much as we can. So, our next social influencer is what we call de-individuation. And it is a big, long word, but essentially what it means is you have a sense, a loss of self awareness and self restraint occurring in group situations that foster sort of an aroused or excited temperament and anonymity. So, I'll give you an example of that. It's Halloween, everyone's dressed up, so you can't figure out who's who, so you have that anonymity. And everybody's hyped up either on candy or on the excitement of being out in the dark and all of the excitement that goes with Halloween. So someone says, let's go egg some houses and let's go egg some cars. Because you're dressed up, because there's this sense of excitement, you act in a way that is probably outside of what you would normally do alone. So you have this sense of excitement, anonymity because you're in costumes, and you commit the act of egging people's houses or cars. You're more likely to act in a group poorly than you would be individually. And that's because of de-individuation. The bigger the group, the more likely de-individuation occurs. The next concept is group polarization. And this is an interesting one because it has to do with group discussions. So the idea here is that the enhancement of a group's prevailing inclinations through discussion within the group. So I'll give you an example. The political parties that happen during presidential nominating conventions, they meet and they come up with a platform, which, as you know from your history in government classes, is kind of the stuff that a political party believes in. And, within a political party, there are varying degrees of what people think are important, what people think should be in the party's platform. But at these conventions, like any big meeting, they come up with some of these big ideas that everybody then has to vote on. And even though you, as an individual Democrat or an individual Republican, might disagree, the prevailing inclination of the group is always what gets put in the party's platform. So here's an example. So after discussing the political platform of the party during the nominating convention, all the Democrats decided that climate change was the biggest threat to humankind. Now, within the Democratic convention, within that group of people, there are probably folks that believe that there are other things that are a big threat to humankind. But because of the prevailing notion that more people believe and more people discussed and more people then voted for that to go in a platform, which I do not believe it's in the platform to begin with, but this is just an example, it prevails. Now, a lot of this happens through discussion, and it tends to be about something that is sort of polarizing, therefore the term polarization. Now, connected to that is the idea of groupthink. And groupthink is another interesting interaction within a small group. And it tends to be a smaller group than, say, like a nominating convention. But what that is a mode of thinking that occurs when the desire for harmony in a decision making group overrides a realistic appraisal of alternative solutions to the problem. So let's take this example. This is kind of a silly example, but it gives you a great idea of what groupthink is. So you're sitting with a group of 3 or 4 people, and one person says, let's start a business selling used tissues, which sounds outrageous and ridiculous. So you've got your 4 people. One person really pushes hard for the idea. He says, we're selling memories, we're selling, all these kinds of things. We can frame them, we can, sell them and make a profit, and people can keep them, and it will be great. And really pushes the idea. So after this person pushes his idea, 2 of the people agree after he discusses it. And then, yeah, this might be a good idea. People will buy it. I really think so. Then you go along with it because everyone else is doing it. And you try and rationalize, well, maybe we'll make some money. Maybe there might be people who want to buy a used tissue. You just don't know. Even though it sounds outrageous, you go along and you do it. Because no one has offered an alternative, The group goes with it. The group decides we're just going to do it. And even though the idea itself might be ridiculous or there could be better ideas out there, that idea prevails because no one has offered a realistic appraisal of the situation or an alternative. So peer pressure is based on group polarization. They talk about peer pressure to drink or peer pressure to do certain behaviors that might not be healthy, whatever it happens to be. And truly, groupthink is the basis for peer pressure because no one offers an alternative to what the action is, even though folks in the group or some folks in the group might think this is wrong or there's a better thing out there. So, very popular examples of groupthink are the Bay of Pigs uh, situation under President Kennedy and the Challenger explosion with the space station, not the space station, NASA in the late 80s. So, the Bay of Pigs invasion, there was a group of people trying to decide do we invade or do we not? And those of you who remember this from American history class would know that they did indeed decide to invade. But because there was no alternative to the invasion, nobody voiced an alternative opinion or an alternative action, they invaded, and it was not successful. The Challenger explosion was the same piece. The Challenger explosion was due to a malfunction on the space shuttle. And there were several people within NASA working in the area where they knew that this was not working right. They had seen some faulty mechanics and had seen some faulty parts. But again, wanted so badly to get this up there. This was going to have the first teacher. She was a social studies teacher from New Hampshire who was going to actually teach a lesson from outer space. And it exploded a few seconds after takeoff. So groupthink is about the group making a decision, but not really looking at all realistic alternatives. And for people wanting to go along to get along. And it can cause some serious problems, like the Bay of Pigs invasion disaster and the Challenger explosion. So these few influencers really impact how we respond and how we act in a group. In our next lecture, we're going to look at attraction between mates. So I'll see you in class, and until next time.